here? No phones? All right.
Hello. Thanks for coming, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Thanks to Matthew for doing the interview. Thanks to Skylight Books for bringing me to their amazing bookstore. We thought that I would read for a bit first, and then we can talk.
Yeah, we'll turn to
right?
it.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we're gonna implicate you people and hopefully get you good lob questions up here as well.
Okay, I'm going to stand to be more declamatory. Am I near enough to the mic? Is that all right? Okay. So just to tell you a tiny bit about the book, it's set in Dublin, in kind of a strange part of Dublin. Dublin, if you've ever been there, is the capital of Ireland, obviously, but it's a very old historical city, and smack bang in the middle of it is this financial district, which was built in the 80s as kind of like a giant tax dodge. And it's where all of these kind of giant multinationals come to do their dirty work. Dublin was referred to as the Wild West of capitalism by the New York Times in the early 2000s. And it's weird, or it's interesting because it's so boring. Like it's in the middle of this kind of very sort of historic, sort of colourful city. It's really anonymous and blank, and it's gone out of its way to make itself look as kind of ahistorical and deracinated as possibly can. Claude is the narrator of the book, and he's a banker. He's French. He's depressed and lonely, and he's approached by a writer called Paul. At the start of the book, he sees this guy in black shadowing him, and finally the guy comes forward and says he's a writer and he wants to write a book about a modern day everyman. Dublin is, of course, the setting of James Joyce's Ulysses, which I'm sure each of you has read several times, and that's a story classically about an everyman, Leopold Bloom, just an ordinary guy at the turn of the 20th century. And this Paul, the writer, argues to Claude that Claude, in his weird, abstracted, alienated life spent in front of a screen in this kind of strange satellite in the financial zone of the city, is a modern everyman in exactly the same way. So what he wants to do is he wants to sort of follow Claude around as he goes about his work, with a mind to putting Claude in a novel about the 21st century everyman. So Claude is initially very happy about this, because, as I say, like he's quite a sort of a sad, alienated character, and he feels that being put in a book will sort of give him the sense of moment and validity that he's lacked hitherto. But he's also scared because he's kind of anxious that Paul will come along and watch him and decide that what he does is actually too boring to be, like, some things are just not representable by art, and banking is one of them, and that Paul will sort of like hold up the mirror and there'll be nothing reflected within it. So I'm going to start at so Paul's been there for a week. It's Friday night, and the bankers have decided to show him their crazy side, so they're taking him to a bar called Life Bar, which is kind of a pun which gets explained down here. I should issue a caveat, which is that so Claude is French, and he's telling the story, so I'm going to read his narration in my normal accent, which is this, but when he speaks I'm going to do it's a French accent that I'm doing. His colleague, his boss, Jürgen, is German, so that's a German accent that I'll be doing for Jürgen. And his friend and colleague, Ish, is Australian. She's a lady, so my apologies to any French and German people here, any Australians, any ladies. I'm doing my best. The thing about French accents, it's funny because I was doing some research on this, and when I listen to French people on the radio or French people speaking, in Dublin, you really can't turn it up high enough. Like the French accent is really preposterous. Like they're very, but if I make a preposterous French accent, it sounds like I'm being a racist. So I don't do that. Anyway. Here is life dark and full of strangers, yelling at each other from their private intoxications like monkeys screeching through the bars of their cage. Music booms all around, prohibiting conversation at anything less than a shout. Battalions of drones, haircuts modelled after the heroes of the day, neck their fizzy lagers, their syrupy alcopops, and perform the minimal courting rituals required before they have sex with each other. The bar style is classic Celtic tiger, white armchairs with zebra throws, ubiquitous mirrors, large unseated area, palpable air of incipient violence, like a cross between a hairdresser's and the Stanford prison experiment. Nevertheless, life is the closest thing the financial services centre has to a local. This is where the real information is exchanged. Who's getting what? Who's hiring? Who's on the way? Up, down, out. Tips for good schools, good builders, good mechanics, good tailors, good divorce lawyers. The name is a pun. Life, or Liffa, is Gaelic for Liffey, the river that splits the city into north and south and broadly rich and poor, and gives rise to many more puns. I hate life. After a few drinks, life won't seem so bad, and so on, which we make instead of finding somewhere less repugnant. On Friday nights, patrons will typically skip dinner in order to start drinking sooner, unthinkable in Paris. Get stuck beside Ish and you'll be treated first to what seems an unending series of cat videos, then, as the hysterical laughter dies away, find yourself attempting fruitlessly to comfort her as she rehearses yet again the breakup of her relationship before lurching off into the night with whichever opportunist bought her last drink. I'm going to skip a little bit forward, so Paul's just about to leave here. And Claude, as I say, is getting anxious. As midnight approaches, I see Paul put on his coat. The end of, French accent, the end of your first week, I say. It is all going well? Sure, he says, but I detect a hesitation. Only, it's nothing, he reassures me. I'm just trying to figure out how it all hangs together. If you have questions, maybe I can help. At first he blusters nothings, then he pauses, looks at me as if deciding whether to take me into his confidence. I feel like I'm missing something, he says. I've got the characters, what you do, the rhythm of the day, but I feel like I'm not getting to the heart of things, you know? I must look very worried because he claps me on the shoulder. It'll come. Maybe I just need to change my focus a little bit. We will see you on Monday, I say. Of course, he grins. Have a good weekend. You're off camera. Let your hair down. Not long after the lights come up, life begins to empty, its pinchbeck promises having slipped away as always through the cracks of the night. We gather our things and make our way outside. I'm deep in thought. What Paul said about missing something bothers me, and as if picking up on that, Jürgen, brackets German, says, "So he has told you it's going to happen?" Happen? In the book? Oh, we know what is going to happen in the book, I say. It is about me, a modern everyman experiencing a typical day. Yes, but there will be some kind of story also, yes? Well, that is the story, I say. That is the story? I say. He says, yes. You sitting at your computer writing research notes about banks? Is that right? Jürgen says nothing to this. It's not supposed to be one of those books where things happen, I explain. It's about discovering the humanity in ordinary lives. Oh, Jürgen says. There's another silence. It's not going to be boring, I say. Of course not, he says. Around us the centre looms darkened and empty like a perspex necropolis. I think again of Paul's parting words, and anxiety quickens in my sinews once more. Oh, I reckon he's got something planned for you, Ish says, who's Australian, as you can tell. Like what? Like, I don't know, maybe you fall in love. I'm not going to fall in love, I say categorically. In the books, this is exactly the kind of thing the main character will say right before he falls in love, Jürgen says. Yeah, says Ish. Plus, you're French. You lot practically invented love. French kissing, French letters. It's the whole French thing. How would you feel if I said the whole Australian thing was kangaroos and tinnies and daytime soap operas? That is the whole Australian thing, Claude. Why do you think I left? Yes, well, then you will understand that not everyone fits into the national stereotype. I certainly do not think that when people speak of the typical German, Jürgen chuckles, they're imagining a crazy man who loves reggae music and writes articles about medieval economics while listening to reggae music on his computer. My point is that adventures, escapades, dramatic reversals, falling in love, these are the hackneyed tropes that Paul is trying to get away from, I tell Ish, though I'm perhaps trying to persuade myself as much as her. He wants to depict modernity as it genuinely is. Love's not hackneyed, Ish says obstinately. What does love have to do with this place? I throw my arms up at our surroundings, great glass panopticons surveying all the other panopticons. I'm serious, what does love have to do with anything we do all day long? That's what he'd better work out, Ish says, if he wants anyone to read his book. There are plenty of good stories without love. Like what? I think for a moment. 20,000 leagues under the sea. We have emerged onto the quay. Over the river, beneath the concrete skull of the unfinished headquarters, the zombies sleep in silence. Just because you don't have it doesn't mean you don't need it, Ish says, staring into the dark water. Every story needs love, even at the bottom of the sea. Is that enough, or will I do another bit? Or?
I defer to you. You said you were going to read 2 bits, right?
Can I read another quick bit? Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay, right.
Please.
Are there any Ukrainians here in the audience? Okay. We're good. Okay. So Paul has gone for the weekend, and Claude has spent the weekend fretting about this, the idea that Paul has some kind of intractable problem with the project, and he's late for work on Monday. When the writer arrives at the office, he's not alone. A man is with him, a great hulking creature almost 7 foot tall, with a sloping forehead and brawny knotted forearms that extend from an ill-fitting nylon shirt. Paul introduces him as Igor Struma, poet, professor of contemporary art, and member of the celebrated Vladivostok Circle. It's going to be helping me with some of the more conceptual stuff, Paul explains. What exactly this means, I'm not sure, but for the rest of the day, instead of observing me and my colleagues, the two of them spend their time muttering in secluded corners or slinking around the office, making inscrutable gestures, knocking on walls, poking at ceiling tiles, tracing with their fingers mysterious vectors from the floor behind computers up to the power supply. I have a bad feeling about this, Igor. One cannot say what a poet ought to look like, of course, any more than one can say what a murderer ought to look like, but he definitely looks more like a murderer than a poet. He smells bad in several different ways at once, like curdled milk in a public lavatory, and when I type his name into the search engine, a red virus warning sign flashes up immediately onto the screen. The others don't seem to share my reservations. Jürgen, on the contrary, is positively ecstatic. 2 famous writers, we have almost enough to start a salon. What is he doing here? Has anyone checked his credentials? Paul asked him to help out with the book, Ish says. You said yourself he was having a few problems. This is a good sign. You don't want him to pull the plug on the whole thing, do you? Of course not. I'm just confused. If Paul is writing a book about me and my work here, why is he spending all his time with some poet? This is the artistic process, Jürgen says with a shrug. Who are we to question it? I don't want to obstruct the artistic process, but when I see Igor, under Paul's supervision, making a gun shape with his thumb and finger and boring an imaginary hole into the wall, it's hard not to think the novel's being dismantled before my very eyes. Later that day, Paul invites me to the cafe for lunch, with his helpmate nowhere to be seen. Thought I should fill you in a little on Igor's role, he says, as the waitress guides us to a table. You're probably wondering what he's doing here. I'm writing the book. You're the subject. What am I doing, bringing a third party into it? I make a stock gesture of innocence, as if the thought had never crossed my mind. The fact is that while the romantic image is of the writer working away in solitude, it's often much more of a collaborative activity. Every writer has his strengths and weaknesses. It's quite common to draft in a colleague to help out with elements you're less sure about. I've heard about such practices in other art forms, but I confess that I had not encountered it in literature before. Kind of a trade secret, Paul says. Can you give me an example? Example? Well, I suppose the most famous partnership would be J.R.R. Tolkien and Ian Fleming. Really? Oh yeah, when Tolkien was putting Lord of the Rings together, he was great at working out, the ancestral backgrounds of the elves and so forth. But in terms of plot, he was hopeless. So he brought in someone who did know about plot, his old friend Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond. The whole magic ring thing was Fleming's idea. In the original version, Tolkien was just going to have the hobbits and the elves reciting poems to each other. I didn't know that, I say. And similarly, Tolstoy, when he was writing War and Peace, found the peace parts no problem, but really got stuck when it came to war. So he got in touch with an up-and-coming young naval officer called Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, go out to war and peace? Just little bits here and there, details. Like I say, writers generally prefer not to talk about it. And what is Igor specialize in? Places. He's a master. Big places, small places, indoors, outdoors. He can do mountain ranges and lakes. He could write a paragraph about a broom cupboard that would have you bawling your eyes out. I suppose you could say he's got an intuitive grasp of structure, which you feel has evaded you in the bank, I say. Exactly. It's an unfamiliar environment. To be frank, not one that readily yields up its inner poetry. That's true, I concede. So I thought, okay, time to call in the expert. Given that I have this incredible access, which I'm so grateful for, I might as well take advantage of it. So Igor is going to be concentrating on the location details, the character stuff, plot, all that will still be me. This does make sense. And you have known Professor Struma for long? That man taught me everything I know, he says simply. Oh, I say, struggling to conceal my surprise. Perhaps I have misjudged him. At that moment the door opens, Paul waves and Igor lumbers creaking towards us. He takes off his ancient rainmack, releasing a cloud of pungent inner odours, and gives the waitress his order with a dry smacking mouth. He stares after her as she leaves, like a cat watching a pigeon. So I was just telling Claude something about the collaborative process, Paul says. There's nothing wrong with collaborating, Igor says, rather confrontationally. I mean, in the book. You're going to help me out with the book. Igor says. The book, Paul repeats, set in the bank, the tale of the everyman. Oh, yes, Igor says. Everyman, James Joyce, real life. His bloodshot eyes swivel over to me. You want the Frenchman, he says. Paris. That's right, I say uncomfortably. There's quite a rude joke here, which I'm going to skip. It went down very badly in Boston, so... Back at the bank, the situation only gets worse. He keeps poking at the ceiling, Gary McCrum complains, prodding at it with some sort of a rod right over my head. Joe Peston storms over. That fucking Russian of yours unplugged my terminal. He's researching a novel, I tell them both. Computers are interfered with, files misplaced. Kimberly, the receptionist, approaches me in a state of disquiet to report that she sat down at her computer, only to find Igor under the desk, apparently sniffing her seat. He's examining the structure, I say. But the truth is that I have no idea what he is doing. As for Paul, he barely speaks to me. He's too busy lifting furniture, pulling up floor tiles, taking paintings from the walls and staring at the blank, pale spaces that are revealed. When I approach him, he snaps at me or nods without listening. Whatever has eluded him about Bank of Torabundo until now, Igor's appearance hasn't helped find. In the short time he's been here, he's aged visibly. It's not your fault, Ish says. It's the next morning. We're in the canteen with the door closed, eating cereal bars. It feels strange to be hiding from our own narrator. It's what Jürgen said, the artistic process. Writing a book's hard, that's all. Maybe a bank isn't the right setting for a novel. Well, he's got to make it the right setting, hasn't he, Ish says. That's his job, not yours. I keep thinking he should have written about Aoi, cocaine, hookers, multi-million-dollar trades. He didn't want that, Claude. He wanted an everyman. Could be he's not found the right one. You're crazy, Ish exclaims. You're a brilliant everyman. You think so? Definitely, she nods. I've been watching you, Claude, and you're doing a great job. She squeezes my hand in hers. Just be yourself, she says. Anyone would want to read a book about you. I'm touched by her words, but it's increasingly clear that my non-life in Dublin has defeated Paul's powers of representation, that there's simply not enough here for his art to gain a foothold. And when I emerge from the canteen, the final blow descends. Liam English, the head of the department, calls me over. Look at this, he says. On the other side of the room, Igor is holding the water cooler steady, while Paul balances on top of it, unscrewing the vent over the air conditioning, apparently with the intention of inserting some kind of camera into the interior. I tried to make light of it, remarking on the incredible concentration that artists bring to bear on things that we take for granted, such as air vents. Wrap it up, Liam English says. I'll stop there. Thanks.
I'm going to sit for this part, I guess. That was great. Thank you. As Allison alluded to, I think at the beginning, this is, on the one hand, I read this feeling that this was, maybe the best novel about kind of finance and that world that I have ever read, and there are actually quite a few of those. But it's also far and away the funniest, and of course, it's probably the only funny novel about banking that I've ever read. And I'm sort of curious how you, one of this book's kind of fantastic strengths, and I might add that it really, I'm not going to give anything away, but it really explodes that world. That it's not exactly set exclusively in the world of banking. It covers a lot of other ground, but you do manage to bring a lot of information into it, and at the same time, I never feel like it's what's what Jonathan Lethem refers to as the Wikipedia bits of a novel. Oftentimes you'll be reading a book and you sort of go, oh well, this is the part where Jonathan Franzen tells us everything he knows about thus and such, and I not for a second in this book does the information intrude upon the delight. And I'm curious about, first of all, do you have any kind of background in finance?
No, and quite the opposite. I have a background of being, having my loan applications rejected. I mean, so that's most writers' experience of banking, is being told, you can't have a mortgage. So the first job I had out of college, so Claude is French, and there's a certain amount of French philosophy in the book, or kind of, French philosophy. And that kind of goes back to the first job I had when I left college. Was it wasn't in a bank, but it was in what's called the banking operations center. This is in '97, so people still paid for things by check, and basically every check that was spent in the country was sent to this operations center, this underground bunker, and put in this enormous processing machine to be scanned and filmed and barcoded and so forth. And my job was to put the checks into the machine. And it was a very sensitive machine, so if the checks had like a corner or a staple or something, the machine would break. And so I had to stand there like literally for 8 hours a day. I was making minimum wage, and there was millions of pounds going through my hands every day. And it was quite alienating. And the closer you got to Christmas, you started at 2 p.m. and the closer you got to Christmas, the longer you'd have to stay, because you'd be there till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. because people were spending so much money. So I really started to hate capitalism at that time. And I sort of, I was really sort of disappointed at how meaningless my college degree was, because I studied English, and I'd sort of thought like there must be, even though everyone had said, don't do an English degree. When I came out, I thought there must be some sort of value to that I could use my my reading of Paradise Lost in some regard, and there wasn't. I was just standing at this thing day after day after day. And just realizing that the real world did not care about any of that stuff that I held to be so important was like quite a chastening lesson to learn. And I got interested in French philosophy around that time because I was living with my parents. My dad's an academic, and he had this Roland Barthes reader at home, and I picked it up one day, and I read it, and I could understand about sort of 30% of it, and it seemed like like what's the one thing more sort of arcane and irrelevant to kind of modern kind of capitalistic society than an English literature degree, French philosophy. So I started pursuing French philosophy at that point. So that's kind of a rambling answer. I don't have a background in finance, but I lived through Ireland went through like this incredible boom from about '97, just when I left college, till about 2007, and went from being like a really kind of an agrarian sort of backwater that people just left, like everybody just left. If you had any sort of chops or ambition, you'd go to the United States or the UK or Europe, whatever it might be, and suddenly it changed very, very suddenly and drastically into this global powerhouse. No one quite understood how that had happened, but suddenly there was money everywhere. And then just as suddenly in 2008, the crash came, and all of that money disappeared. So it was a really sort of frightening time, because it seemed like this new country that had arisen from. I mean, the new country was very problematic. There's a lot of problems that the new rich, money-oriented Ireland had, but it had risen from this, like, the Irish history, if anyone's familiar with it, is just this like unrelenting, lament of like misery and trauma. So like it was like 10 years of good times, and like people sort of like people genuinely did, like, people just acted like dicks for 10 years. It was like sort of a 10-year bachelor party, and everyone was like driving SUVs and like wearing sunglasses, which you don't need to do in Ireland. You just don't need to do that, But you sort of think, like, give them some leeway. It's been terrible for like whatever 4,000 years. So we'll have 10 years of where we can sort of just be a bit of a tool, and then it'll settle down. But it didn't settle down. It just the bottom dropped out in this utterly comprehensive way, like that nobody had been expecting. And I'd been working on the previous book for about 7 years, Skippy Dies, and I kind of emerged from my cave to find that like, the place had just like disintegrated. Like it was, you'd walked in the streets and they were empty, because like nobody was going to the shops, and like everyone was waiting for the country to basically foreclose, for the banks to foreclose on Ireland Inc. and for the place to go bust. So I got interested in finance and all of this kind of jargon because it was at that period inescapable. It was like all anyone talked about. Every day you turn on the news and it'd be some like really arid number, like would be behind the news anchor, like 0.1%, and something terrible would happen to like bond yields or something like that, and everyone would be going, oh jeez. So I wanted to start a new book, and I didn't initially want to write a book about banking. Why would anyone want to write a book about banking? But at the same time, it felt like there was nothing else to write about. It felt like it was driving everything. Every other story that you were being told was kind of underwritten by this enormous kind of black hole of debt that had been brought about by the kind of greed and ineptitude of the country's bankers and leaders. So I started researching it, and I spent a long time just reading books, and it was difficult in Tula. It was difficult to make to understand what they were talking about, and it was difficult to make the stuff. Like I did get really interested in this, but if I talk to my friends about credit default swaps, they'd immediately glaze over, or pretend there was a fire in the car. So that was hard. Like it was hard to kind of like try and find a way to make it credit default swaps funny.
Yeah, but you did. I mean, that was sort of my kind of next question, I guess, was, and we were talking about this a little bit before. I feel like in the States when if someone is going to write a book about banking, it usually is kind of it tends to be like, well, this is a serious novel, unless it's like a satire, like Tom Wolfe writing a satire, and this book is certainly not a satire, but the sort of comic novel in the States is considered like there's an odd, I don't know if it's a snobism about it, or maybe just people just don't know how to do it. And I was wondering, like whether, and this book is so effortlessly funny. It's funny before it's anything else in a way, and so it was not exactly easy for you to you didn't just sit down and start splitting your own sides with.
No, I had to. I would naturally be drawn to writing humorous stuff and humorous dialogue. And Dublin, again, to advert to Ulysses, like Ulysses is a book about just two dudes walking around, just running into people and talking. Like it's a very kind of garrulous city. Right. So I guess you develop. If you want to write about Dublin, like my sense would be that you need to do it in dialogue to a certain degree. And people in Dublin, like no one. Says what they're thinking. Like people talk in jokes. Like Dublin's sort of a weird place in that like Ireland is kind of like, my sense is that Ireland is kind of known for sort of like authenticity and sort of good, honest folk and so on. But in fact, Irish people are quite cloaked, and are always finding ways to distract you from what they're actually sort of thinking. Right. And a lot of the time that's done through like either like just being drunk or else jokes. Like people.
I think of Joyce as a comic novelist, Flann O'Brien. I mean, the Irish, like when I think of the Irish novel, I do tend to think of, the comedy as being kind of a main, the main branch of it. Yeah, right? Well,
not to sort of kind of start I don't know, waxing lofty, but like Ireland's a post-colonial country, so Ireland, like historically, Ireland's been independent since like 1920, 1921, and before that it was just run by this succession of empires, it's the British and the Normans and the Vikings and the Church, whoever else, but so the Irish, like, sort of, it's not, that sort of mentality doesn't lend itself to taking yourself seriously. Like if you've just been booted around for like sort of 2,000 years, right. You don't really put on airs and graces. Like your attitude to power is kind of fairly ironical, I suppose. Sure. And that lends itself to making fun of things, right. To making fun of the powerful, because like he's just locked you in the coal cellar, so you come out you right. Behind his back, right. Whatever. That's sort of how Ireland sort of transacts itself. And like I think like the comedy. I think you're right. I think that the comic novel, like it's the same on the other side of the Atlantic. The comic novel is sort of seen as a bit in for dig. By the establishment, and I don't understand that. I think that. Gary Steingart wrote a good essay recently about Saul Bellow, and Saul Bellow being this kind of consciously sort of highbrow writer, Yeah. And
but he's a comic writer.
He's comic too, right? Yeah,
very.
Yeah. But Gary Steingart was saying that, like, in a modern world, because there's so many, like, obviously there's so many distractions, right. So many easier things people can do to write a book, that writers have this sort of obligation to write sort of performatively, like right. Write in some way that will engage you and bring you in. And if you're writing about something like finance, the financial crash. Right. like I think that's even more necessary, because it's such a turn off for people, even though like we're still like mired in this stuff, and even though the problems haven't been addressed at the same time, like certainly in Ireland, maybe it's a little bit different here, people just don't want to think about it. They just want to think about it. So you have to find some kind of slant by which you can make whatever point you want to make, without beating people over the head with it. So like a really obvious way of doing that is to make the narrator the banker. So it stops me from just going on some sort of a tub thumping screed.
Well, that actually brings me to my next question, which is one of the other pleasant surprises one of the myriad surprises of the novel is at the beginning you introduce us to the French banker. You bring in the novelist whose name is Paul, and of course that when that happens, generally often in American novels, I think this is kind of an arch like substitute for the author, and Paul in the novel really turns out to be far more multifarious in his purposes and his personality than I assume you are. I still have my wallet, so I'm going to say that he is.
A second.
But I wanted to ask. I guess that I was curious about. I assume giving him your name was not an inadvertency, that you were inviting us to identify with him, or to identify him with you, even if that was a bit of a deek. And I'm curious what that.
Yeah, it's weird. Like I don't have a kind of like one straight answer to why I called him Paul. Like it was like we were talking about like Brady Snellis earlier on, and he was discussing Lunar Park recently, and obviously Brad Ellis is in Lunar Park. Yeah, and he said like that's the only way he could find his way into the character, and by the same way, like I like initially I was going to call so I'll give you very quickly the several reasons why he's called Paul. Like there's a long history obviously of writers putting themselves in books, like Cervantes is in Don Quixote, and right up to David Wallace is in The Pale King, and there's many iterations, and to the point that it's kind of people could be forgiven for rolling their eyes at this stage. So I didn't want it to just be some sort of arch kind of like metafiction thing. Like, so why did I call him Paul? Like, so initially, like, he was going to be called Paul Murray because Roland Barthes was talking about Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes has written this book, wrote this autobiography called Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. Yeah. So I was going to call the book Paul Murray by Paul Murray, but like even my eyes were rolling to the back of my head. And I thought that another reason for calling him Paul was that Claude's French, and he's got this part of the reason he's French is that my sense, maybe wrong, I remember I'm romanticizing it, is that the French still have this very kind of reverential idea of what the artist is, and they in France, like, an artist is still someone who's who's looked up to as kind of a seer and wears black polo necks and big glasses, and I always think of Paul Auster in that regard, and I always think, so Paul Auster is like this capital W writer, who sort of sometimes appears in his own books, and my sense is that Paul Auster's account of being a writer was at variance with every other writer I know's experience of being a writer. So that was another reason for calling him Paul. But ultimately, it was like I tried changing his name. I was going to call him Randall Dunwoody for a while. Were you? And it just felt like. I mean, it started off as a gag. The whole book started off like I started writing in 2002, before the crash, and I put it down. It was just going to be this sort of comic two-hander. And there wasn't enough there to kind of just give it traction. And then when the crash happened, I kind of went back to it and saw that financial world in an entirely new light, like everybody else. And equally, I realized that I didn't want the artist or the writer in the book just to be this kind of, like, he is this kind of a deeply duplicitous man, and he's a hack, and he's on the skids. He's married to a lap dancer, and he's given up on art. Like, he thinks art is obsolete, art is finished in the internet age. But like, it's not entirely a joke, I think that to a certain degree, this writer kind of. Like, everybody is kind of threatened by obsolescence in our modern world. Like, we're all sort of like, it's kind of like it's constantly drawing in, more and more, not just writers, but like proper professions such as, are sort of like are in danger of being rendered obsolete by technology. Equally, the writer, there's a lot of stuff in the book about the gift economy, which is kind of probably a bit too complicated.
Is that a Lewis Hyde thing?
Yeah. Do you know that book?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
That's an amazing book, about. So Lewis Hyde, I won't be able to give a proper account of it, but it's a book about how can you be a writer or an artist of any kind in a kind of mercantile.
The book is called The Gift by Lewis Hyde. Its full title for a long time was The Gift, Imagination, and the Erotic Life of Property. But I think I think because when it was published in the UK, when Kennedy did it, Jamie Bing chopped he was just like, enough about that. That's too academic. We'll just call it The Gift. Thank you. Yeah, and it is a really wonderful book about. It's I guess it's technically a kind of work of anthropology, but it's very conversational and anecdotal and rangy, and it's fantastic.
And so any if you are working as an artist and you're feeling dispirited by modernity, I would refer you to the Gift. Like, it's really very, very powerful book. So he talks about the gift economy, which is something that like anthropologists discovered in all Pacific islands. So instead of bartering is a myth created by economists. In pre-market economies, people would give things, and the gifts that they would give would be passed along, from one person to another and from one island to another, and the story of the giver would go with the gift, and the gift would go around and around and around for generations. So, there's a famous anecdote about an anthropologist who was in this one of these Pacific islands for 10 years, and then as he left, he gave his guide a gold watch to say thank you, and he came back, 15 or 20 years later, and he found that everyone on the island was wearing a little piece of the gold watch, So it's like an entirely different concept of property. And the idea is basically that by giving, you're creating like a bond between people. And these gift circles, as they're called, are ways of binding people together. So writers and artists and other people of that kind of stripe, they're kind of like that's a kind of a gift economy that's working there. I mean, if you're working as an artist, it's you're not doing it for money, really. Like, most artists aren't working for money. And what you're hoping will happen, there's sort of a presumption of it requires a certain amount of faith in people that people will want what you're doing, and your hope is that it will help them in some way, and they will, pay the gift forward, and that art is kind of like this binding thing. So I guess Paul sort of represents not just writing and art, but just the whole sense of togetherness, as Dublin is a place that where people have this kind of quite strong sense of community and bonds. And that's sort of imperiled, that's being increasingly imperiled by this new Dublin that's represented by the Financial Services Centre, which is based on technology and money, and this kind of very ruthless and alienating individualism that kind of Claude exhibits, and is making him very sad.
Yeah. I'm curious too about you mentioned French philosophy, and of course the book's title, The Mark and the Void, is, we discover, I mean, it has many meanings and resonances throughout the book, but it is within the book also the title of a work of philosophy by a French philosopher named Claude Texier, who has retired, or who anecdotally had retired to start painting instead of doing philosophy. But I quite believed in the existence of this French philosopher while I was reading it, and then it took me a while to sort of be like, no, wait, you're making this guy up. And I'm curious sort of where that obviously just, you drew him out of that interest. Were you modeling him on any particular
Okay, we're going down a dangerous path, because I love all that stuff, but people will be running for the doors.
Okay. So, we have to go too.
No, I love French philosophy. A lot of French philosophers I find impenetrable, like Jacques Derrida. I find I can't do anything.
It's impossible.
Yeah. There's a guy called Gilles Deleuze, who's a kind of a very, very, he writes a lot about art and about writing, and he's very into sort of creativity and affirmation, and he's very, very powerful, and I really loved him a lot. And Barthes is like a very sort of humane, kind writer, and they're all writing about this kind of this golden. They had this kind of golden generation in 1968, when it seemed like sort of like art and philosophy, and also blue-collar workers and students and all of these different elements of society were going to come together and create something new. And instead they didn't, and instead the world went the opposite direction and became much more kind of hard on people and cruel in some ways. I think that one of the ways you could have told that he's not a real philosopher is that you can read that bit and it makes a reasonable amount of sense.
Yeah.
I was reading a bit about. I will stop talking about French philosophy, but my one anecdote is there's a philosopher called John Searle who's based in I think he might be based in California, I'm not sure. But he's very, very good friends with Michel Foucault, and Foucault confessed to him that to be a successful writer in France, you would not be taken seriously unless there was 10%, unless 10% of your writing was made no sense, actually made no sense.
Right.
So Searle thought it was very interesting, and he met Pierre Bourdieu.
Yeah.
And he said to Bourdieu, Foucault says you have to write 10% of stuff that actually doesn't make any sense. And Bourdieu looked at him, was silent for a long time, and said, "It's more like 20%."
There's not very much, in fact, barely any actual French philosophy in this book. But there's a fair amount of I feel sort of like publishing is sort of, there's I mean, there are obviously other things, but as you get deeper into the book, there's some sort of wonderful satire or depiction, howlingly funny depiction of publishing and of particularly Paul in the book. His dark horse is a very successful Indian novelist named Bimal Banerjee, whose first book came out at the same time and sort of swept off with all the accolades. And the book, I feel like one reads the book and comes away with a fairly, the depiction of the finance world. One gets the sense of not of a disproportionate judgment of the people within it, but the view of finance doesn't seem particularly. You seem like someone who hates capitalism. That's what I'm trying to say. Which I do too. Except my agent is here, so except when she practices it. But the publishing stuff. You mentioned. Paul's sense of despair, and it made me think of one of the lines in the book that made me laugh out loud is that complaining that your novel is being ignored is like standing on a corner with your fly open, complaining that no one has stopped to give you a blowjob, and I just wondered if your view of publishing is quite as steely as your view of finance.
I don't know. I mean, I don't hate capitalism. I'm okay with capitalism. I mean, I guess I want to just sort of. My standard thing that I would say when I'm talking about the book is there's this famous Oscar Wilde quote: "When bankers dine together, they talk about art, and when artists dine together, they talk about money." And each of the characters in the book, so Claude and Paul, are sort of opposite poles, or they seem like opposite poles, and each one wants what the other has. So the banker looks at the artist and he sees this guy who lives in this state of grace, whereby he doesn't have to think about the tedious world of paying your bills and the grubby minutiae of things, because he's elevated above that because he's so kind of immersed in his art, And meanwhile, the artist is looking at the banker and thinking, he's thinking I want that. I want what he has. I want the grubby. I want to. Just give me the money. Give me the flat screen TV and give me the the SUV and give me the. I will take that, and I don't want the soul anymore. So each of them has sort of quite a sort of a kind of a stereotypical view, I guess, of what the other represents, and they discovered that. I mean, the journey,
right.
if you have to say that, is like that they're kind of alike. They're sort of two lost souls,
right.
And they kind of have to help each other. So just sort of wake up and come out of their respective wells of loneliness and try and be just a person in the world, Yeah. Where was I going with that? Can you remember?
I think I was just asking if your kind of view of publishing, that you sort of that we were talking about fighting that feeling of obsolescence, or how Paul is fighting that feeling.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to in Dublin, it's kind of the thing you can't complain about. If you can pay the rent working as a writer, then that's you're blessed.
Right.
That's a fantastic thing to be able to do. So I'm grateful for that. The Celtic Tiger, this weird boom in Ireland was a strange time to be a writer, because in Ireland, literature is like the only thing that historically we've been any good at, like, literally the only thing that we've been good at. So like for all of the many sort of centuries beforehand, it's the one thing that Irish people could sort of like look to give themselves some consolation for being Irish, and when the boom came, in like 97, like the whole country sort of reoriented itself like 180 degrees in this really sort of overt, kind of conspicuous, literal way. And one of the sort of one of the consequences or manifestations of that was that writing became kind of like passé or anachronistic, So like this was what we used to do in the days of misery and when it rained all the time and stuff. But now people were just too busy having fun, or going on shopping trips to New York, or like buying properties in Armenia, whatever they're doing, So they didn't really need that. So you felt like in a really strange way like that. I mean, it's like every writer, I think, at the moment feels to a certain degree like imperiled by, like I say, like other people, other walks of life too, feels imperiled by technology and how the world is changing so fast. And I think this economic boom gave people, like writers in Ireland, like a very, very sort of sharpened sense of that. And I think that the dangers of that is that the dangers of feeling kind of imperiled and straitened is that the danger of that is that you kind of are tempted to make dark choices. You're tempted to kind of cater to the market, or to try and give people what like you think that instead of writing the book that you want, which is what you're always told you should do. Right. You feel like you should start writing, like a big long historical novel about right. Whatever donkeys or like of which there are thousands in Ireland, So in the book there's this. So Paul is like haunted by this very popular Indian novelist called Bimal Banerjee, who does write these big books about genocide. So like there's a certain strand of criticism in Ireland whereby like comic books or books that are funny are sort of seen as being somehow kind of vulgar or trashy, and if you want to write a proper book, it's about genocide of one kind or another. So this guy Bimal Banerjee has written a book called Ararat Rat Rap, yes. Which is it's about a singing rat who is, I can't remember what happens in it, but anyway. Yeah.
There is a genocide in it. Somehow, yes. He's written a book about a hip-hop, a rat, R-A-T, who becomes a hip-hop star, right? Yeah. But it does somehow tie to the Armenian genocide. Yeah.
It's like the 2,000 years of genocide told through the perspective of a rapping rat. And he's so like this is kind of, so Paul goes to this dinner and it's just one of these. I'm sure you've been to a lot of them, right?
Many of them.
These like hellacious dinners, where there's like just a really obvious hierarchy at the table. Like there's the guy who's throwing the dinner, who's like the kind of respectable kind of like Irish novelist whose books are like, I think they're described in the book as being like taking a bath in Rohypnol, sort of fall asleep after a couple of pages and wake up not remembering anything but feeling kind of violated somehow. So he's there and like he's kind of he's there's a certain amount of writers in Ireland like that who are just, they're kind of holy cows, you sort of, it's like you were saying earlier, like it's kind of like going to church and you sit down, you dutifully read the book, and so he's there, and then this kind of this serious-minded Indian novelist is there, and then there's like Paul, who's just this, who's failed, like everyone knows that he's failed, and he's just trying to find ins to the conversation, and it's abject,
It's an amazing scene.
So I mean, that scene was like originally about sort of 5 times longer.
Which should have remained so.
Don't put that in.
Great. I think we should open up the floor here to see if any of these people. I just wanted to add that when artists get together, I don't think that they talk about money. Then nor do they talk about French philosophy. They talk about TV, just like anybody else.
It sounds like an international cast. I mean, between the Frenchman, the Ukrainian, the German, the Indian. Is that a self-conscious thing that where Dublin's become more international and with the European Union? Is that kind of self-conscious deal with it? It's kind of international.
Yeah, big time. Yeah. Does everybody hear the question? And okay. So yeah, again, like, not to hark on about this kind of strange transition, but like it really was like this kind of through the looking glass moment in 97, 98. Like when I was in school and in college, like Ireland was, I think, the most monocultural country in the world apart from the Pitcairn Islands. Like it was, like literally everybody was white. Like literally everybody was white. There was like Phil Lynott, who played bass for Thin Lizzy, and there was Paul McGrath, who's like a footballer, and that was basically, there were no other black people, and it was just, you know, and then very, very quickly, so when the money kind of came in, which it did very swiftly, suddenly you had sort of economic migrants coming in from like largely from Eastern Europe and from Nigeria, and then you had people being brought over by these multinationals like Google and Facebook and so forth who were working there. So it suddenly became this. I mean, it would be like James Joyce would have had it was a field day, because it became this kind of wonderful polyglot city. You know, suddenly there was all these really good-looking women walking around. You know, it was really exciting and different, and but it was quite tiered as well in a strange way, you know. So you have the people working in the financial services centre, like Claude, for instance, and they tend to be from one part of the world, you know. They tend to be from Western Europe or from the United States, United Kingdom, and then the people who are, you know, cleaning the place are from Ukraine or from Russia or from, and that seemed to me to mirror, if I can wax grandiose for a second, about capitalism. So you've got these two mirror images in capitalism, whereby on the one hand you've got these, basically Dublin transformed itself into a tax haven. So for instance, it has this really low rate of tax for corporations. So all of these companies come over to kind of avail of the tax rate, and also more pertinently to avail of the lack of regulations. But there's a big sort of scandal at the moment, because Apple, it turns out, was paying this secret extra low tax rate. They're paying 2%. So they forewent. They didn't pay like $19 billion in tax, and currently I think John McCain was raising that. So Ireland is now sort of in the doghouse in many ways, you know, for being a kind of a rip-off Republican. So on the one hand you've got this sort of tax haven, which like is basically available to very, very rich people, and then on the other hand you've got these export processing zones, which is places in, like, you know, Macau or the Philippines or parts of China, whereby the government says, like, hands over the territory to these corporations and says like, okay, the tax laws don't apply here, the labour laws don't apply here, you can kind of do what you want. So it's trying to slightly get us. So Paul's married in the book, is married to a woman from, it's like a made-up country called Ectovia, which is like near kind of Russia or Moldova, and she's working as a stripper, but she's got a degree in literature, you know, and you meet people like that all the time. I mean, I'm sure it's the same here, you know, but it was really interesting for me to be able to write about that, because it's very, very new, and it seemed to me that like this new Ireland that has appeared, like it's actually like a great way of trying to write about the world beyond Ireland, you know. So I enjoyed that. Yes, sir.
Could you, just in a related way, could you maybe talk a little bit about the sense from the novel that you get that the bankers and the powers that be were convinced that they would have no problem, putting in a policy of austerity with Irish people? Because you were talking earlier in the Q&A about a history of anti-colonialism and resistance, and also through humor and on the cultural side of things. So why? Can you just say more about how this seems so easily imposed by comparison to, say, Greece, where austerity was a big...
Yeah, that's a really good question. Without wanting to get too political, Ireland is like, it's post-colonial, like it's not anti-colonial. The thing about Ireland is that it kind of tended to it's a tiny country, you know, and it didn't have the wherewithal to resist any of these mighty empires, you know. So finally, like, you know, Britain just pulled out because it was expensive to run the place. It was tedious for them to deal with these things. But by and large, like, Ireland has a real problem with confronting power. So So things tend to get not addressed in Ireland, like and I tried to get at that in the book a bit. Like Ireland has a long and very traumatic history, as I was saying, but it tends not to get addressed. Like, it tends just to be swept under the carpet. So, like in the first book, the previous book I wrote, there's a bit of stuff about the First World War. So all of these Irish soldiers, like 50,000 Irish soldiers died in the First World War, but they're like literally didn't appear in the history books because while they were at war, while they were at the Somme, literally, Ireland had this uprising, the 1916 uprising. So they came back and they were traitors, you know. So they're rubbed out of the history books. Like the Civil War, by the same token, was just not in the history books. What happened? All these terrible church scandals were like not confronted for decades and decades and decades. And now the banking thing is like people are very angry about it, but nothing's actually happening. You know, no one's been sent to prison. Currently, there's a guy called like the worst. Probably the kind of the worst offenders of the banking crash was a bank called Anglo-Irish Bank, and they achieved notoriety. Like I don't know, the crash sort of operated slightly different in Ireland than it did in the United States. So in the United States, you had like the subprime mortgage crash. So you had these analysts, rocket scientist type analysts, who were creating these incredibly complex like algorithms by which they thought they could sort of they could sort of evade any kind of like they could make it sort of risk free to take on all of these incredibly these huge sort of subprime mortgage loans, and they were wrong, you know. So I call it the kind of the clever stupid crash. And in Ireland you had the stupid crash, whereby like what you had was like banks. It was like this huge property bubble. So you had these banks which were just throwing just huge amounts of money at developers, you know. So you'd be like a developer, and you'd meet your banker on the golf course or in the pub, and you'd say like, I need 5 billion euros, and the banker would go like, okay, because the thinking was in Ireland that it was this, like we were living in this economic singularity whereby like the boom, this property boom would never end, you know. And if you read like any history book at all, or had just been alive during any part of the 20th century, you know that's just not the case. But they kept doing it. And like the Economist magazine, this very influential magazine in London, like in 2003 was issuing these warnings saying, you know, you'd be on the front cover saying like, Ireland, Jesus Christ, you know, or something like that. Ireland, WTF. But in Ireland, you know, the bankers and the economists would just go like, you know, no, like don't like, leave us alone. The bankers had like, again, like this transition had occurred, and the old way of doing things, the church, which had its own problems obviously, which had used to be sort of like, you know, told people how to live, had sort of been replaced by the bankers, the wealth creators, and they were regarded now by people as being the ones with the special knowledge, and they brought us this new era of like SUVs and you know, lattes and sunglasses and so forth. So nobody wanted to rock the boat. Just let them do it. Like don't rock, you know, don't damage it. And famously, the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, the Prime Minister, said like people who sit around cribbing and moaning about you know the possibility of economic default, he said, I don't know why they don't go off and commit suicide, you know. So it's just like shut up and let them do what they want, and they did, and the banks tanked, and this bank, Anglo-Irish, was the worst and lost the most money. And there's a guy who's currently he fled to Boston. His name is David Drum, and he's currently incarcerated because they're trying to extradite him to Ireland to try him to face the music, you know. And he was like the biggest villain because the bank was given like 7 billion euros by the government to try and tide it over, which wasn't enough. But this tape came out subsequently, wherein Drum and these other bankers are talking about the 7 billion loan, and 7 billion in Ireland, because it's such a tiny country, that's a lot of money, you know. And they're laughing and going like, fuck, why do we even get 7 billion? And Drum goes, I pulled it out of my hole. So just like this, the darkness, you know, just the terrible darkness. But there's this culture of like impunity. It doesn't matter if you're rich and you're powerful, then like it doesn't really matter what you do. Like no one is going to be put in prison. But I don't know, maybe it's the same here. Like I was talking to this is it same here?
Oh yeah.
Okay, all right, yeah. So I was talking to this financial journalist a couple of days ago about this guy Dick Fold. Do you know Dick Fold? Dick Fold was the head of Lehman Brothers, and it was really interesting to me just how like for all of the sort of the the abstraction and the sort of the quantitative nature of banking, like it fundamentally comes down to interpersonal relationships. It's like anything else. So we're talking like about how Bear Stearns had gone down in March of 2008. Subprime mortgage, had clobbered Bear Stearns, and the bankers sort of came together and pulled Bear Stearns out of the water. And Bear Stearns was a bank that I'd researched. It was run by these two horrible people called Ace Greenberg, who was 90, and Jimmy Cain, who was 68. And Ace Greenberg was only staying in power because he hated Jimmy Cain, and he wanted Jimmy Cain not to be boss of the company. And Jimmy Cain, they were both worth billions and billions and billions, but they both stayed. They were both there just because they hated each other. But the bankers bailed out Jimmy Cain and Ace Greenberg and Bear Stearns. But Dick Fold was known as the gorilla of Wall Street, and was known as, in an industry that rewards sociopathy, was known as like just the biggest asshole on Wall Street, the most horrible, depraved, awful person on Wall Street. And that's why Lehman crashed, because like when Lehman went down, they went to the Fed and said like we need to rescue Lehman Brothers, and the bankers all went like, well, Fold is in trouble, and they said, we're not going to do it because we hate Dick Fold. So this huge crash occurred basically because of Dick Fold and everyone hating Dick Fold. If he'd been nicer at like the golf tournaments, the pro, like maybe the crash wouldn't have happened. So it's really strange. And she was saying this. Can I get this? Can I just try and find the stat here?
Yeah.
So I was complaining about like Ireland like never sort of addressing its problems, and she was saying it's actually America is not doing that either. So Dick Fold and Lehman Brothers are responsible for a financial collapse which in the US alone has cost more than the New Deal, the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the 1980s savings and loan crisis, the invasion of Iraq, and the total cost of NASA, including the moon landings, all added together and adjusted for inflation. And Dick Fold is now offering his services as a financial consultant. So if you'd like to, I guess you could hire him and then do the opposite of what he says. Like maybe you get rich. But she also said, this financial journalist said that like nobody ever learns. Like history teaches us nothing. And Ireland, I think, like is a particularly bad instance of that. But I guess it's sort of prevalent everywhere. But the hedge funds are already ready for the next crash. Like the next crash is they're expecting it'll be college loans. There's $1.5 trillion of college loans out there. The default rate is 20%. When it hits 25%, then that's the crash. That's the next crash. So they're already shorting things like textbook publishers, construction companies that build college dorms, that kind of thing. So don't take financial advice from a writer, but but that is to say, like I guess. It just seems to keep rolling. The whole thing seems to keep rolling over and over and over again, and getting worse and worse each time.
I feel like you've just given me ideas for, how scary Halloween costumes. Ace Greenberg. That's a trustworthy sounding fellow. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, one more, and then we'll.
To go back to your first book.
Okay.
Yeah.
I fell in love with Gene Tierney. I read that book.
Oh, right, great. Yeah.
How did you? Was that something that you already knew about before you began to write that book through the character, or did it just happen?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So the first book I wrote was it's called An Evening of Long Goodbyes, and it's about this kind of sort of 25-year-old layabout who lives in this very beautiful posh part of Dublin called Killiney, which is near where I lived. I lived in sort of the crappy suburban part, but in Killiney that's where Bono lives and so on. It's about the boom, and this boom that's just about starting at that point. And this guy is sort of like a wannabe aristocrat, and he's disgusted by all this like vulgarity and stuff, and he just wants to sit around his beautiful house and watch movies and black and white movies. And at that point in my life, that's really all I wanted to do. I just out of college, and I didn't want to get a job, and I didn't want to. The real world frightened me, and all of this change frightened me, and those film noirs are really they're kind of about that kind of anxiety, I guess, right? They're about if you're familiar with these film noirs, I think they made them all in they're all made by these German expressionist directors who'd fled. Like a lot of them were Jewish, so they'd fled Germany and they'd come here. And always like really gifted like directors called Fritz Lang, and they were making these B movies for no money, and they're all just about like being trapped in a machine. Like they're all trapped in this plot machine, and there's always this weird sort of fear of women in them, because I think women were in the workforce for the first time because of the Second World War. Like because so many men were away, the women working in the factories, and this is like terrifying to everybody. But Jean Tierney was when I was a kid. I used to come down when I couldn't sleep. I'd come down and watch TV with my parents, and I remember that film. Like I remember Laura. I remember, and like Jean Tierney is just this like luminous, this hypnotic figure. And I was working in a bookshop. I didn't know anything about her, but I was working in a bookshop in '99, I guess, and I was starting to write that book. And I was working in the cinema section on the top floor, and no one ever came up there. So I used to just spend all my time reading these. The internet didn't really exist, so I'd read these cinema encyclopedias, and just find out about her. She had this terrible sad life. I don't know are you guys familiar with Jean Tierney or yeah. So she was very vulnerable and very fragile, and she was very beautiful, and because she was beautiful, she was kind of fed into this, the sausage factory that is like the Hollywood star system, and she has this succession of just the wrong husband several times, and she started to go crazy, and it was very very sad. I can't remember the details. I remember I think the last movie she made, she was starting to crack up. She was making it with Humphrey Bogart, I think. Was it the African Queen maybe? And she was just hallucinating like crazy, and like Bogart was very kind to her and was very protective of her, but then eventually she just couldn't do it. She couldn't survive, and she left Hollywood, and she went to she ended up marrying a millionaire, and recently there was this street photographer on O'Connell Street, and he just took pictures of you'd pay him like a shilling or whatever, and he'd take pictures, and he was there for like 60 years. O'Connell Street, is the main thoroughfare in Dublin, and his archive has just come to light. It's just been digitized, and who's there except Jean Tierney, and maybe she's like 60, and she's wearing a fur coat, and she's there with her millionaire husband, and she looks great, So that was really that was a really nice way to end that story. That's. I guess in the book, the character Charles is very worried about his sister because she's fragile, and that's how he sort of maps his anxieties onto Jean Tierney, and she's I watched a lot of her movies as research for the book, and like she made a lot of really terrible films. Yeah, Laura's like an amazing masterpiece. Yeah. Is there anything else, or do you want to wrap up, or?
Yeah, let's that's it, right?
Okay.
Time for you guys to get some books signed.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.